As Erwin Kotler has said in many places and many times, the Holocaust, all genocides start not with bullets, they start with words. The words that the Jewish experience with genocide is introduced into Western language are forced conversions, expulsion, inquisition, ghetto, pogrom, genocide, Holocaust. Those words did not exist before the 1,000-year history of what Raoul Hilberg called the destruction of the European Jews. It started as a political weapon and proceeded into urban legend with broad acceptance. Because people, the mass of people, are basically failures as individuals. You have to accept that. You're going into a world where you're going to be leaders. Kumbaya doesn't work in the real world. An Israeli minister named Yair Lapid 3 years ago gave a speech at the Berlin train station from the platform where his parents were shipped off to Auschwitz. Lapid is center-left in Israel, a television anchor, looks like George Clooney. And he said, we have a problem in this world, and we have a problem with the younger generations not understanding or accepting that there is total evil. That you can't talk to, that you shouldn't talk to. That, as one CIA director said at the time when they were hunting bin Laden, bring me the names of people to kill. That's the world you're going into. And I'll get to why it applies to Canada in a moment. You're seeing a drift to right-wing populism. What's called populism. It's not populism. Let's call it what the hell it is. It's prejudice. And how do holocausts and genocides happen? When fiction becomes fact and is used as propaganda. When outlandish, hateful opinions go from the fringes of society into mainstream thought and are considered normal because we have to hear the other side. Everybody's got a right to be wrong, right? It then leaps into organized political parties, and they try it out. Too many immigrants, too many Jews, too many citizens of color. And when those parties see that it does them no harm, as we've seen in France, as we're seeing in Hungary, as we're seeing in Poland, and yes, to a certain extent, as we're seeing in the United States, they continue. I mean, after all, God forbid we should have political leadership that actually seeks to do good, to handle the tough issues, to challenge people to do better. Much easier to make prohibitions and tell people, oh, it's to protect you. Much easier to target and rally people's hatred, because that gets you votes. Never assume that the political class today, the vast part of the political class, has any good faith. The bureaucrats in politics, most of the elected officials in politics, are there for one reason, to get reelected and get their pension checks. They don't dare to care, and they run between the raindrops. They will not tell you what you need to know. They will feed you only what you want to hear. And that is the great and awesome danger. For those of you who studied history, can you imagine in today's world a leader standing up and saying, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country? By the way, anybody know who said that? Really? That was President John Fitzgerald Kennedy's inaugural address. That was a challenge to a new generation. That was the beginning of the Peace Corps. That was the beginning of the Alliance for Progress. That was the beginning of hundreds of thousands of young people, your age, going to Africa and Asia and Latin America, building villages, building waterworks, bringing health care. And those of us who came to political maturity when his brother Bobby was killed and when Martin was killed, we understood one thing, that after the tragedy of the Holocaust, these leaders brought hope. They challenged consensus. They didn't try to balance consensus. They spoke for the vulnerable. They spoke for what is just. For their trouble, they got their heads blown off. Now, you should know that Ladbrokes, which is a gambling establishment in Britain, very old gambling house, once calculated the odds of leaders of this stature, John and Robert Kennedy, Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, getting killed in a 5-year period. They were 3.5 trillion to 1. You should understand that the bloody summer of 1968 sent a message to the political class: go this far and no further, because there are very dark elements out there. It's more sophisticated today. They're not marching with brown shirts in the streets. But the message is clear. The responsibility of those of us in social action is to challenge that, and there aren't many. And we don't get these awards because of our work. We get them in spite of our work. So yes, when you're responsible for getting 24 Montreal cops suspended for racism, you get a Martin Luther King Award, but the effect on you as an individual in this society is not that salutary. For those of you who think that, well, we don't have it in Canada, we're okay, we're good. We're a gentle country, this Northern Dominion. We accommodate. Diversity is our strength. Do any of you understand that statement, diversity is our strength? Diversity is a compassionate way of applying laws. Diversity cannot be a strength if you're not teaching your citizens to accept the basic fundamental values of freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, respect for secular pluralism, not demanding what your country can do for you, but demanding what you could do for the greater values of mankind. Nobody dares challenge you that way today. There's been a great expression that it may start with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. The acceptance of genocide and elimination of a population has pretty well become standard operating procedure. The Holocaust was a preeminent Holocaust, but you'd think mankind would have learned something from it. Not simply create a United Nations that is impotent to protecting people. Instead, in the post-war era, we've had 2 million killed in Cambodia, 2.5 million killed in Darfur, 2.5 million Darfuri blacks killed by their co-religionists. They were Muslim simply because they were black. 1.5 million killed in the Balkans. And on and on and on. It doesn't stop. Because it becomes a matter of policy. Because it gets into people's minds that the fiction that becomes fact through propaganda suddenly becomes a catechism. That it's okay because they're subhuman. You know why the Jews and the blacks have always marched in common cause in the struggles for civil rights? Because in the Western world, not in Africa, not in Eastern Europe, not in some backwaters of Asia, in civilized Western Europe and in North America, there were only 2 people who by law had second-class status: the Jews and everybody of African descent. By law. That meant that we could be property. That meant that we couldn't live or walk on the same streets. And not that long ago, we're talking about the 1950s in Canada. No dogs or Jews. Jim Crow experience in the South, I hope you've learned. It's still not over. You don't want to be a citizen of color today, after Barack Obama, still in the southern United States. I don't recommend it, but perhaps you should do what I did and go down to Mississippi and Louisiana, as I did after Hurricane Katrina, and see it in the 21st century. It's there, it's alive, because people need somebody to blame for their failures. Because instead of teaching self-reliance, instead of teaching the individual responsibility to excel and to contribute, we teach submission to collective will. Collective will doesn't work. That's life by committee. You have a greater responsibility than that. So you'll say to me, but Beryl, how can you say that? We're in Canada. Look at the pictures of Lake Louise. It's wonderful. It's beautiful. I will say this to you, that there is no other nation in the Western world that is as good at hypocrisy as Canada, of fooling ourselves. Let me give you some points about Canada. Canada has been condemned 3 times in the past 4 years by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development for having the worst social security system in the Western world. We're the only developed industrial nation that keeps its seniors $9,000 below poverty after they've worked the whole life. Our public health system is a shambles. Our transport system is non-existent. Workers are working at cheaper jobs for less money than at any other time in our history. We are the most indebted nation in the G7. Our debt to GDP on the federal level is 35%. If you bring in the provinces, because we're a split jurisdiction, we're at 70%. And when you bring in consumer debt, we're at 130% of GDP. No Western country has that number. The system cannot hold, as the poet William Butler Yeats said, the center cannot hold. And you will see in your lifetimes not that far away, when it does fall apart, there will be all kinds of finger pointing. Some of it you've seen today. It's the immigrants. It's the strange ones. It's the ones that are coming in. As if somehow, before this period, Canada was wonderful and pure. Here's some truth about Canada. In 1918, Sir Wilfrid Laurier stepped down as leader of the Liberal Party. He was a great man. He was a great leader. The Liberals went out to choose somebody else. The man they ended up choosing had, in 1919, the year before, had written a memo to the Rockefeller family. The Rockefeller family had, massively wealthy, but he was particularly concerned with their mining holdings in Colorado in the West. And that was a miners' strike started by John L. Lewis, the great labor leader. And the strike was particularly virile in a town called Ludlow, Colorado. So this man wrote a memo to the Rockefellers suggesting that they call it the National Guard, that the governor call it the National Guard, and that the governor, and that the Rockefellers themselves bring in their own trained shooters and shoot the miners. They did. 30 miners died. It's called the Ludlow Massacre. You should look it up, Ludlow. The man who wrote that memo went on to become Liberal leader and Prime Minister of Canada for 26 years, William Lyon Mackenzie King. The war came, the 30s came, the Nazis were elected in Germany. Canada, believe it or not, had quotas for immigrants by religion, race, creed, and country. Our quota for 1 year for German Jews was 13,500 for 1 year. Canada is the only country in the Western democracies that in the 13 years of Hitler's reign, in 13 years, took in less than its quota for 1 year. Mackenzie King, unlike Chamberlain did the Munich Pact. where he thought there would be peace in our time. But he knew that Hitler was a madman and a killer. Mackenzie King in his diaries actually wrote that Hitler was a gentleman who understood how to restore order in a society. As late as 1940, he didn't want Canada to enter the war. The only reason Canada entered the war was it was part of the British Empire, and Britain entered the war, and Canada had to enter the war. It was Mackenzie King's order that the refugee ship St. Louis, with 966 Jews on board, not be allowed to land in Canada. It was returned to Europe, where 3/4 of the passengers died in concentration camps. You may have heard Prime Minister Trudeau offer an apology for that this year. I wrote an editorial saying, I wish Canadian leaders would stop apologizing to dead Jews while condemning living ones. After the war, King wanted to know how many refugees Canada should take in. Gordon Robertson and O.C. Skelton, the two senior bureaucrats at the Department of Foreign Affairs, wrote back a famous memo saying, none is too many. None is too many. That was Canadian immigration policy. None is too many. This is Canada. This is the heritage of sand built on the bodyguard of lies. Because sadly, when you show a Canadian a picture of Lake Louise, they think all is right with their world. Fact, fiction, and propaganda. I want to tell you where you live, here in Montreal. And it's important because we're going into fights right now that will determine how people will react. The mosque shooting may just be the beginning. I don't know. In the 1930s, Quebec had a terrible right-wing alliance. Maurice Duplessis was the Union Nationale premier, who had made a deal with the Catholic Church, by the way, that put the crucifix on top of the Speaker's chair in the Assembly. He gave the Church control over education and health care. His political base was organized around three men. One was Abbé Lionel Groux. Yes, Lionel Groux Metro Station. Abbé Groux wrote a series of tracts through the 20s and 30s, was widely adored in Quebec, and his guiding philosophy was, and I quote, "The blood of the blacks and the Jews will never mingle with the purity of French-Canadian blood." They're worried in the South about statues of Confederate generals? Yeah, they shouldn't have been put up, but people who live in glass houses. His second ally was a man named Adrien Arcand, who organized a Nazi movement in Quebec that was so big that it numbered 50,000 blue shirts. And I recommend to you or your teachers that you see a documentary done by a Montrealer named Eric Scott called Je me souviens. In Delormier Stadium, where Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in baseball, every Sunday until the beginning of World War II, 50 couples would get married and would give a Hitler salute to the stands where Arcand was standing with his blue shirts. Montreal, 1938. The other leg of the stool was Montreal's mayor, Camillien Hood. Nasty little man, ugly little man, who was an open supporter of Hitler. It became so bad in Montreal that in 1941, by the time Canada was fully in the war, the federal government had to jail Hood and Arcand and keep them in jail for the balance of the war. There was that much popular support for the extremism of their positions. After the war, they were released from prison. Hood got reelected, but it wasn't popular anymore after the pictures of the camps to call yourself a Nazi or to say anything nice about Hitler or to say anything nice about segregation. So they reorganized themselves into a political bloc called the Bloc Populaire. Now, the Bloc Populaire, on Saturday nights, they like to do things like burn synagogues along St. Lawrence Boulevard, beat up blacks. They would be jailed. The police would get there after they give them 20, 30 minutes to do their worst. And they would be bailed out Monday morning. The lawyer for the Bloc Populaire was Jean Drapeau. Young lawyer, needed a client. Jean Drapeau would, of course, be Montreal's longest-serving mayor into the 1980s, serving for 34 years. Pretty good mayor. But the Bloc Populaire forms the political organization and foundation of many of the parties that we have in Montreal, in Quebec today, including the first separatist party, the Rassemblement pour l'Indépendance Nationale, led by Pierre Bourgault in 1960. You couldn't write this. If I submitted this story to the New Yorker and said, could you publish this little short story about a city 360 miles north of New York? They wouldn't believe it. And you're not taught it. Because it's easier to forget than to confront. But you know what happens when you don't confront? At every moment, when you don't confront lies, and there are lies of commission and there are lies of omission. If you hide something, it's as bad as saying the lie. We do a lot of that here. You know, Quebec in the 19th century was a different place. This whole nasty alliance that we're still fighting with today in Quebec started because of the conscription crisis in World War I, where the federal government said no conscription. There was, and a greater percentage of Quebecers were in uniform than a percentage of Americans in World War I, and II, by the way. But they came back and they were angry. A lot had died and they were angry at the federal government, and that's why you saw this rise of this right-wing populism, as you're seeing right now in Europe. The frustration. But in the 19th century, Quebec was a much different place. And we no longer look to the better angels of our nature. In the 19th century, Louis-Joseph Papineau, the leader of the Patriote Rebellion, in the middle of the rebellion, emancipated all minorities 20 years ahead of England. Jews didn't have to take their oaths on a Christian Bible. Every citizen could vote regardless of color or religion. Not women, unfortunately, but men. 20 years ahead of England. In 1848, Louis Lafontaine and Robert Baldwin made the first responsible government in the British Empire, here in Quebec. It survived. In 1865, in the Confederation debates, a man named Aimé Dorion wanted political parties based on language and religion. Sound familiar? Sir Georges Etienne Cartier, McDonald's partner in Canada, said, non, j'ai une nouvelle vision pour une nouvelle caractère politique national, avec aucun lien de ni religion, ni langue. Cartier won. Today we have a debate on laity, laïcité. By the way, you want me to switch between English and French? How many would prefer that? Or English is okay? English is okay? English only? Yes? Okay. In 1905, Sir Wilfrid Laurier gave an interview to a reporter, and the reporter asked, what are you most proud of in your political life? Quelque chose de plus fier. And he said, je suis très fier, I'm very proud que j'étais condamné par les prêtres protestants, that I was condemned by Protestant priests et excommuniqué par les prêtres catholiques, and excommunicated by Catholic priests. That Quebec had a political, progressive patrimony unequaled in North America. Then came World War I. Then came the forces of darkness, la Grande Noirceur, as the Duplessis era is called. And that battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness we're fighting till today in Quebec. And it was fought on the basis how a society can become corrupted. It was fought on the basis of lies. Duplessis, Arcan, Gru sold Quebecers on the idea that they were fighting the King's War, that they were exploited by les Anglo, even though as many Anglophones died as Francophones, even though it was true that World War I was not World War II. World War I was a shouting match between royal families. But they used that as a lever of racism, of exclusion, of what Martin Luther King called nullification and interposition of les autres. Not that your church kept you down. Not that your church kept you on the farms. Not that your church didn't let you into commerce. Not that your church and your leadership made deals. No, it's the fault of les autres. The Jews, the Italians, the citizens of color. It's their fault that they're taking your jobs. It's their fault that you're not going to college because there's no place for you. The fact is that in the 80s, when I went to law school, McGill had quotas for Jews. We had to score 10% higher. In the 80s. Forget about Justin Trudeau's, it's 2016 or 2019. This is the picture of Canada. One hypocrisy, one lie on top of another. Creating a new mythology. And because history, which matters over everything, if you don't know where you came from, you don't know what's going to be coming at you. You're going to assume that everybody's angels. Well, mankind is not angelic. And if you don't know how to deal with that, you're useless to society. You're taking up air. Go, make money. That's fine. You have a right to it. Your parents brought you into the world. But don't pretend to engage in public debate. I tell you all this about Canada and Quebec because sometimes it has to be driven home why this issue, why the Holocaust, why Israel today matters to you. Because the methodology of alienation, the methodology of mendacity was devised long ago. And as Joseph Stalin said, tell the broad mass of the people a big lie often enough, they'll believe it. Through history, the Jews are the canary in the mine shaft. It starts with the Jews, it never ends with the Jews. It goes to everybody else. And the message was always the same. We don't hate the Jews. We just hate their religion, was the message from the Inquisition through the 17th century. In the 18th and 19th, we don't hate the Jews. We hate their race. That was Hitler's underlying philosophy. Oh no, I have nothing against Jewish religion, but the race, the blood, that's going to infect us. And Germany, the most civilized and educated of all nations, the percentage of Germans who graduated college in 1932, higher than North America's. Bought it. And when I say bought it, obviously not the majority. It doesn't take a majority. Hitler only got 31% of the vote. It takes silence. Your life is worth nothing if you see injustice and don't do anything about it and only worry about what your paycheck is going to be at the end of the week. You do understand that whatever you may think of divinity, of our existence here, human beings are more than the animal that knows that he knows. You feel a spark of the divine in you every time you have an intuition about anything, every time you have a problem, and you feel something in your heart moves you. If you deny that specialness about you, you deny your worth as a human being. So you have a choice to make. You'll be making that choice over the next few years. How do I lead my life? What am I going to feel in the face of injustice and hatred and demonization of people who live 6 doors down from me? And what responsibility do I have? And I'm not asking you to make the right choice because I want you to be saints. I did not choose to be an activist after law school because I'm a saint. I'm the furthest thing from it. I love pleasure. My religion is hedonism. But I have a physical revulsion at hypocrisy and injustice. I don't want you to be saints. I want you to be physically revolted. I want you to be addicted to kicking injustice in the ass. I want you to get a physical rush every time you get a politician to apologize or a corporation to stop exploiting the vulnerable. As much as you enjoy dancing or partying or anything else. Because you know what? Unfortunately, the saints don't get things done. You have to be in the streets. You can't theorize about it. You have to be in people's faces. But to do it, you've got to feel it in your gut. And that brings me to the centerpiece of fact, fiction, and propaganda today. And I have to talk about it because Israel, and don't everybody jump at once, is the last great cause. It's the civil rights question of our time. Not because Israel is perfect. But you have to understand how the virus of anti-Semitism seeped into the body politic, seeped into the media, seeped into academia, where it started. From 1948 to 1973, a period of about 25 years, Israel could do no wrong. I mean, this was the remnant. This was 500,000 people speaking 35 languages after the Holocaust who held back the armies of 50 million neighboring Arabs. There was no way Israel should have won the War of Independence. They should have been slaughtered and driven into the sea as the Arabs wanted. Perhaps that was the culmination of what Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, said, if you will it, it is no dream in whatever you do in your life. When the United Nations partitioned what we know today to be the West Bank, Israel, and Gaza into a Jewish state and an Arab state, does anybody know which was the only country to recognize the Arab state of Palestine, which, by the way, had never had an independent government from the time of the destruction of the Second Jewish Commonwealth in 79 AD by the Romans. It had been part of the Roman Empire, the Carthaginians, the Ottoman Turks, you name it, never had an independent government. Does anybody know what was the only government to recognize the new Arab state of Palestine? Nobody. Israel. And what did the 5 neighboring Arab states of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt do? They invaded, with the promise of destruction of the Jews and driving the Jews into the sea. The Jews held. Jordan occupied what was to be the Arab state of Palestine for 20 years without giving them independence. Why? They needed something to demonize the Jews with. Except that the Arab states were constantly launching wars of aggression. In 1956, in 1967, in 1973 on the Yom Kippur War and the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. In international law, and it should matter, mankind's fleeting attempts at progress, if you're attacked and you take land in your own self-defense, you get to keep that land until you get peace, until you get recognition. In 1967, 2 weeks after Israel had successfully fended off the Arab armies, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the guy with the eye patch in case you might have seen an image, said to the Arab states, we're giving back everything. Everything you want, take it. All we want is recognition and peace and no more war. The Arab League convened in Khartoum in the Sudan and issued a declaration 48 hours later saying the 3 no's. No recognition, no peace, no end to war. And that has been official Arab League policy for 50 years. In that time, and I'm a 2-state solution guy, but you need to know this. In that time, yes, Israel has a presence in the West Bank. They moved out of Gaza. In the West Bank, Israel gave Mahmoud Abbas 150,000 rifles for his militia. Israel invested so much in the health and education infrastructure in the West Bank that the Palestinian Authority has the largest percentage of college graduates in the Arab world, an infant mortality rate as low as Israel proper. All they want is for them to recognize Israel, to pull out. Abbas is saying no. How could that story, that's fact, that's not, I'm not defending everything Israel does, I'm not defending the destruction of the homes of suicide bombers or terrorists, but how did those facts get lost in all this over the past, since the 73 war? You need to know this too. Human greed and money. 1973 war, 5 Arab states attack Israel. On Yom Kippur, most of the soldiers are in synagogues. Israel lost 1,000 dead soldiers out of a population then of 6.5 million. The counterattack was so successful that Israeli troops were literally in the suburbs of Damascus and 10 kilometers from Cairo. And they pulled back. But what happened after that war? OPEC, the oil cartel, particularly the Arab world at that time, led by Sheikh Zaki Yamani of Saudi Arabia, decided to put an oil boycott. They did two things. They did an oil boycott of the West, which drove up prices for about 6-7 months. And they did another thing. They played the long game. Arab states started funding in almost every major Western university chairs in Arab studies. It was a brilliant move. And they hired as their director of public affairs and public relations, which is why I tell you, values mean something. It can't be about money because you're nothing as a human being. Who did they hire? Howard Rubenstein and Associates. Yes, a Jewish PR firm, the one that invented the I Love New York Big Apple logo. They hired them to direct their money. So what happened over the following years? University like McGill. You're an assistant professor, you're looking for tenure. You look at the board, gee, there's 2 openings in Jewish studies, there's 24 in Arab studies. Guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go for my seat. I'm going to go for tenure. Yeah, but how am I going to explain the fact that I have to create a myth, create a fiction, that I have to propagandize and flip the story around, that I have to make students forget about Arab aggression and make them understand that there is no good and evil. There is no right and wrong. Everybody's got a right to be wrong. Everything's balanced. They did it by lying and by twisting history. They forgot all of this. Suddenly, they forgot to mention to students that Arab genocide against Jews did not start with the state of Israel. It started in the 1920s when the religious leader of Jerusalem, who spent the war years with Hitler propagandizing on radio and raising 2 Arab divisions for Rommel's SS, ordering a fatwa against Jews. Between 1929 and 1937, 8,900 Jews were slaughtered, killed in the streets. Their favorite way of killing Jews, by the way, they would stop a bus, tie up your hands like this, tie you to the railings of the bus, cut a Star of David into your back, and wait till you bled to death. Not mentioned anymore. What Israel does in the territories, that's good, not mentioned anymore. They built up this idea of Israel as some kind of super state. Israel's the length of Israel is from here to Quebec City and from the St. Lawrence River to Amos. That's it. In the middle of 27 Arab states. The myth was created. This Conway lady who works with Trump talks about alternate facts. They created 2 generations of alternate facts. It started here. It started on the campuses. It started with lies. It started with the elimination of a fact, the recreation of a fiction, and then the creation of propaganda tools. So in a very short order, by the 1980s, we had students coming out of universities who went into the media. And they, like you, had very little knowledge of history. They wanted to earn a buck, write a story. So their point of reference was their professors in the universities, in political science and elsewhere, who left out the facts. And suddenly the media took a turn. It was no longer, in the 60s and 70s, you used to go down to the southern United States, and even the most anti-Semitic cracker would say, them Jew boys can fight. Well, suddenly that didn't become that anymore. In the Northeast and on the West Coast, it suddenly became, well, you should know what they're going through in the West Bank because you went through the Holocaust. What does the Holocaust have to do with the West Bank? Whereas I said before, education, health services on a par with Israel. But this was the propaganda that was created. the moral relativism and political equivalency. They created a new language based on nothing to serve masters who are funding universities and producing products that went into the media. Repeat a big lie often enough, and the broad mass of the people will believe it, because the broad mass of the people don't know. The philosopher George Santayana once said, those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. Sadly, in your generation, you're not even taught history. How can you remember? The Gazette ad that says words matter? Facts matter. And unfortunately, both our institutions of higher learning and the media, broadly speaking, are teaching fiction and creating the propaganda that the Arab states have been paying for 50 years. It can happen here. It can happen again. Born out of total ignorance. And that is a tragedy. And that is a tragedy that is your responsibility and your generation's responsibility if you choose to take the standard to prevent. Thanks very much, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to take them.
So I have a microphone, and if you have a question, just raise your hand, and I will come to you. Anybody have any questions?
Oh, come on.
Okay.
Somebody must be pissed off at something I've said. It doesn't have to be a question agreeing with me.
Okay, I have a question because they don't seem to be asking a question. I'll start. Okay, so we heard a couple of weeks ago a New York Times article came out talking about Fox News and how it's become the propaganda arm of Trump, President Trump. Can you talk about how large media companies maybe have become more propagandized and less about facts?
And I mentioned this, I don't know if you were in the room, but I mentioned this about what they teach you in college and the people graduating, they're going into media. So I don't find CNN, as some people in the center-right find CNN unbalanced on these things. Sometimes I think they're a little too balanced, but they're pretty normal. I said this to my Israeli friends as well, of the center-right. And it's a lesson in life. If you believe in something, you got to be careful of who or how closely you ally yourself with them. Because if Donald Trump revolts my aesthetic sensibilities. That was my #1 complaint in the primaries. And if somebody doesn't have a respect for civility in the public discourse, even if he agrees with you, be careful how closely you align with him. You can be civil, you can take their support. In the vernacular, you don't have to be up their ass. Now, Fox News is a huge problem. Anybody, I don't presume any of you know about what's called the Fairness Doctrine. So Fox News was born out of the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine was an American law passed in the 1930s because America was so filled with segregationists, anti-Semites like Father Charles Coughlin, who had a national network, that the Roosevelt administration passed the Fairness Doctrine, which said what? It said that a network has an obligation to present opinion fairly. If you're going to present one part of opinion, present the other side too, or give the other side the chance to come on if they want. In the late 70s, a man named Roger Ailes, whose name should be familiar to you, the founder of Fox Network, he was an assistant to President Gerald Ford. He was later an assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and under Reagan, he convinced Reagan to eliminate the Fairness Doctrine. Roger Ailes went on to found the Fox News Network. I don't want those kind of allies. Fox News is a serious problem. They misinform the public the other way. They're the guys that make it possible to propagate a message that when Trump said during Charlottesville, there are good people on both sides. Really? How you say what you say is as important as the content of what you're saying. You can't be excused from, as Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Marshall McLuhan, for those of you who don't know, is the father of modern media. He was Canadian. You should get his book, The Medium is the Message. How you present what you present is as important as the content. You don't get to say there were good people on both sides. Fox News' problem is that except for a few good reporters like Chris Wallace, they're propagandists for something that's intolerable. And what's intolerable? The manner in which public policy is presented. And I have a lot of arguments with some friends of mine on the center right, and I'll bow to nobody on my support for Israel, for example. I've served in the army, I've bled, and I would continue, but I don't need to accept that help that way. Accept the help, but don't ass-lick the guy. How you present what you present is as important as what. So, his business of build a wall, build a wall. Why inflame hatred by saying I'm going to build a wall on the Mexican border because Latinos are coming, Hispanics are coming over, and they're killers and they're rapists and blah, 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 blah. There is a security problem on the southern border. But why not come out and say we have a security problem? And I'm going to continue the work of President Eisenhower, who started the first wall on the Mexican border. Put it in context. Trump didn't want to put it in context, neither does Fox News want to put it in context. To a certain degree, MSNBC doesn't put things in context either. But as bad as they are on the left, Fox is still much worse on the right. When Trump said, I'm stopping visas to all Muslims until we figure it out, there is context, but it's not a religious context. So he said something because his base, his 35% base, who needs to hate. They need to hate like some people need to breathe. What if he had said the following? We have a problem, and America has a problem, and Canada has the same problem. We have a problem with people coming in from the Arab world. We have to check them. We have to screen them. We've got a major security problem. But instead of saying what he had said, which echoed, Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, what if he had said, I'm going to follow the policies of President Franklin Roosevelt, who in 1936, 1937, and 1938 stopped all visas to Japan, Italy, and Germany because he saw the growing fascist and Nazi movements and imperialist ambitions of Japan on national security grounds. So what if Trump had said, until we figure it out, we're going to really carefully screen and reduce visas from frontline terror nations, Syria, Iran, Iraq. That was it. That's all he had to say. He didn't have to inflame. Fox gets its ratings by inflaming. Language is dangerous. And it's an incredible thing to me when you look at the numbers. And Fox, by 6 million viewers on any given night, outdoes CNN and MSNBC. There's nothing to be done about it. I am not in favor of any suppression of expression. I don't care if they're saying, kill the Jews, hang the blacks. Freedom of expression is indivisible, except for overt incitement to violence, indivisible. And it's up to everybody who doesn't like it not to depend on the government to pass laws saying you can't talk like that and be politically correct to the point where we can't make a sentence. Get out there and argue. Get out there and confront. Benjamin Franklin once said, after the Continental Congress, he went out into the street and a woman said to him, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government did you give us? He said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. And she said, what do you mean if we can keep it? And he said, madam, those who choose temporary security in place of permanent liberty shall in the end have neither liberty nor security. That's what we have to guard against. It's an ugly world. It's a tough world. I wouldn't want any restrictions on anybody in broadcasting or anywhere else. One can only hope to rally. I do a couple 100 speeches a year and go out and create a core of people angry enough to go out and confront hate and division and discord. That's the only way to deal with it.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah. Sorry.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Were you listening to some of my remarks earlier? Because we can't do that and call ourselves free people. It doesn't matter. I have France 24 on my television. They're all news channels. We don't succeed if we mirror what we seek to destroy. I don't want to be protected by government. I can confront. All citizens can confront. They asked Winston Churchill, why don't you put in World War II, why don't you put in restrictions on movement? Why don't you put in supervision of British citizens of German background or Italian background? He said, because we don't want to mirror what we seek to destroy. Once we do that, they have a right to be entertaining badly. What do you think CBC is? What do you think the CBC is? The CBC has been cited by international media organizations 44 times for unbalanced reporting on the Middle East. 36 times for outright lies when Neil MacDonald was there. Do we tell the CBC they can't report on foreign affairs? No. I don't believe in hate laws. And hate laws, by the way, only say overt incitement to violence. Take responsibility. I want the government off our backs. I'd rather face the worst enemy and debate them and confront them than have the government tell me what to do or think. You talked about laws. You talked about banning. Only the government can ban. Because people are paying for it on cable. Prove that they promote hate. The legal definition in Canada of hate is overt incitement to violence. Prove, and I'm no defender of Fox News, as you just heard, prove that they do. Why do you want to live in an intellectual prison? I want to hear what Fox News has to say. I want to hear what the Russian news have to say. How can you know what lies are being told? How can you know what facts are being turned into fiction and then into propaganda unless you hear your enemy? You can't live in a bloody bubble. Did you not hear what I said about the history of Canada? We've always lived in a bubble. About what? It's not contradictory to say that I believe in freedom at the same time that I want to fight injustice. Martin Luther King never suggested, in the worst times of the civil rights struggle, that anything be banned, that all the newspapers in the South who overtly incited against blacks be banned. He said to the black community, he said to the white community, to the Christian and the Jewish and the Muslim communities, we have to stand together because it starts with us, it'll go to you. And they won. And they won by being free without restricting freedoms. The restriction of freedoms is one thing that lets fact be turned into fiction or fiction into fact, and propaganda blooms that way. The first thing the Nazis did, the first thing the communists did, what was the first industry that the communists banned in Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution? Was advertising and newspapers. You don't ban thought. You may not like it, don't spend money on it, turn the channel, go into the streets, protest. You can't ban it. You can't have government power talking about restricting expression. That's the road to tyranny. I'm for it. I'm glad you asked. It's in the paper today, actually. And, you know, I'm getting my fair share of abuse from the Jews, from the Muslims, from God knows what. Here's why I'm for it. It is, first of all, I don't think people understand what Bill 21 is. So Bill 21 says that where the intellectual character of a society is formed, where we make the laws, where we enforce them in the courts, where we enforce them in the streets through police and public schools, where the intellectual character of a society is formed, we're not going to have overt religious symbols. And we're going to get rid of teaching religion in schools. That concept. Now, how does this differ from what Marois was doing? Because Marois purposely wanted to incite. Marois extended the ban everywhere, into every health sector, into all the other sectors, into transportation. Nobody really gives a shit if a doctor or a bus driver is wearing overt religious symbols. We're not talking about the intellectual character of a country, of a nation, of a society. And why is that important? Because it has a 250-year tradition of legitimacy. James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers at the time of the founding of America, the civil administration shall take no cognizance of religion. Freedom of religion means freedom from religion. We're not gonna give you tax credits. We're not gonna support you. But we're not gonna menace you either. Do what you want religiously, because religion in the political sphere is the biggest ingredient for explosion. And I'll give you an example. Israel. David Ben-Gurion did not want parties based on religion. He said, give me fascists, give me communists, give me whatever you want. The other members of the government said, okay, one party, National Religious Party, centrist, and its leader was a very respected guy. And Ben-Gurion warned, you let them in, how are you going to stop the guys at the fringes? And today, 12% of the population of Israel, which is religious, controls 23% of the budget. They can't run the state because they have 11 religious parties. We have to go. I hope that answers your question, and read my editorial.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have
Pleasure. I hope it.
somebody's office waiting for me.
Who is?